They told him first class wasn't for people like him. That was the exact phrase one flight attendant whispered to the other, just loud enough for the passengers in the front row to hear. The old man didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just held up his boarding pass with a hand that had once gripped the throttle of an aircraft most of those passengers had never heard of. And he said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Seat 2A, ma'am. That's what the ticket says." 20 minutes later, the cockpit door would open, the captain would walk out, and that same flight attendant would be holding onto the galley counter to keep from collapsing. If you believe an old veteran deserves more than a sneer and a sideways glance, type the word respect in the comments before this story even starts. Because what happened on Flight 1147 from Dallas to San Diego that morning is going to remind you exactly why we don't judge a man by the worn collar of his jacket or the slow shuffle of his cane. His name was Walter Hayes. He was 79 years old, 6'1" in his prime, but stooped now to about 5'11", with hair the colour of pencil lead and eyes that had seen things he had never been allowed to talk about. He lived alone in a small ranch house outside Fort Worth, a house his wife Eleanor had picked out 46 years ago, and that he had not changed since the day she passed. He cooked his own meals, he kept his own garden. He drove a 1998 Ford pickup that he maintained himself because mechanics, he said, charged too much for what was essentially honest work. To anyone watching him board that plane that morning, leaning on a cane, wearing a flannel shirt buttoned all the way to the collar, an old olive-green field jacket folded carefully over his forearm. He looked like exactly what they assumed he was. A retired truck driver, maybe. A widower flying out to see grandchildren. Nothing more. Nothing worth a second glance. Nothing worth a first-class seat. The trip to San Diego wasn't for grandchildren. Walter didn't have any. The trip was for a memorial service. 48 years to the day, an old friend of his, a man whose name Walter still couldn't say aloud in mixed company without the government technically getting nervous, had been buried at sea off the coast of Coronado. Every 5 years on the anniversary, Walter made the pilgrimage. He stood at the edge of the pier. He didn't pray, exactly. He just stood there and remembered. This year was the 48th, not the 50th, but Walter had a feeling in his chest that he might not make it to 50. The doctors had been polite about it. He understood polite very well. So he had used the small inheritance Eleanor had left him, the one he never touched, and he had bought a first-class ticket. Just this once. Just so he could stretch his legs, which ached now in a way they hadn't ached when he was 32, and folding himself into a cockpit smaller than most modern bathtubs. He shuffled down the jet bridge slowly. A young man behind him sighed loudly. A woman in heels tried to slip past him on the left and clipped his cane. He apologized to her. She didn't apologize back. By the time he reached the cabin door, the line behind him had bunched up, and the two flight attendants standing at the entrance had already decided what they were looking at. The taller one, a woman with a tight blonde ponytail and a name tag that read Megan, looked him up and down with the kind of slow appraisal that some people mistake for thoroughness. The shorter one, brunette, name tag read Tiffany, leaned in toward Megan and said something behind her hand. Megan laughed, then composed herself, and turned to Walter with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right section? Economy boarding is just behind us. We can help direct you back if there's been a mix-up." Walter held out his boarding pass. He didn't say anything, he just held it out. Megan took it with 2 fingers, the way you might pick up something slightly damp, and she scanned it. The little machine beeped. The light turned green. She blinked at it. She scanned it again. Same beep, same green. Tiffany leaned over to look at the screen, and Walter watched her face go through 3 small expressions in about 2 seconds. Confusion, suspicion, and finally a tight, pinched little smile. "Well," Megan said, handing the pass back without quite looking at him, "I guess everything's in order. Seat 2A is right up the aisle on your left. Watch your step." She didn't offer to help with his bag. She didn't offer to hang the jacket. She turned to the next passenger before he had even fully passed her, and she said in a voice she clearly didn't think would carry, "Sometimes the system upgrades the wrong people. Don't ask me how." Walter heard her. He had been hearing comments like that for 50 years. He kept walking. He found seat 2A. He set his cane against the bulkhead the way the safety card said to. He folded his old field jacket carefully, the way Eleanor had taught him to fold things, and he reached up to place it gently in the overhead bin. He was slow about it, because slow was all he had left for some movements, and a man in 2B, a younger executive type with an open laptop and a glass of orange juice already in his hand, made a small, impatient noise. Walter ignored him. He settled the jacket so the small set of gold wings pinned to the lapel pointed upward, the way a Navy man pins them, the way a Navy man always pins them, and then he closed the bin and lowered himself into his seat. He didn't ask for a drink. He didn't ask for a blanket. He folded his hands in his lap and he looked out the window at the men loading the cargo hold and he waited. Up in the galley, Megan and Tiffany were still talking about him. Tiffany was the one who said it first. "Did you see his shirt? It had to be 30 years old. And the jacket. God, who wears something like that on a plane?" Megan poured herself a coffee and shrugged. "Probably some companion fare or a bereavement upgrade. Happens more than you'd think. The system catches it eventually." A new voice cut in then, lower, calmer. It belonged to the lead purser, a man in his 50s named David, who had been listening from around the curtain. "You too might want to keep your voices down," he said, "and you might want to lose the attitude before the captain comes out for his walkthrough. He's old school. He doesn't tolerate that kind of thing in his cabin." Tiffany rolled her eyes. Megan laughed it off. They went back to their drink cart. The cockpit door opened about 6 minutes before pushback. Captain James Reeves stepped out. He was 50 years old, lean, silver at the temples with the bearing of a man who had spent 22 years in the Navy before he ever stepped into a commercial cockpit. He always did a walkthrough of first class before departure. It was a habit from his old life. "Look at your passengers," his first commanding officer had told him, "because someday you'll need to know who's behind you." Captain Reeves stepped out of the cockpit, nodded to David, and started his slow walk down the aisle. He glanced at row 1, nodded, glanced at row 2. He saw the old man at the window seat. He almost kept walking. Then his eyes drifted up to the overhead bin, which was still cracked open about an inch, and he saw the dark olive-green collar of an old field jacket. And on that collar, glinting in the cabin light, he saw a small set of gold wings he had not seen in person in 28 years. Not those wings, not that pattern, not the tiny, almost imperceptible engraving of a number, a squadron number, that the US Navy had officially never operated. Captain Reeves stopped walking. He stood there in the aisle. His eyes went from the wings down to the man's face. His jaw tightened. His shoulders straightened very slightly, the way a man's shoulders straighten when his body remembers something his mind hasn't caught up to yet. He took one step closer. He looked at Walter Hayes, really looked, at the thin white scar above his left eyebrow, at the way his hands were folded with the right thumb tucked under the left palm, at the small pin on his collar that wasn't a flag pin but was shaped almost exactly like one if you weren't looking carefully. "Sir," Captain Reeves said quietly. His voice cracked on the word and he cleared it, and he tried again. "Sir, forgive me for asking, but are you Lieutenant Commander Walter Hayes, formerly of Detachment Echo, out of Naval Air Station North Island, Coronado, California, in the years 1969 to 1976? Walter looked up. His old grey eyes settled on the captain's face. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then he said, in a voice as soft as a folded napkin, "I haven't been called that in a long time, son." The captain went down on one knee right there in the aisle of a commercial first-class cabin. He didn't drop. He didn't kneel like a man pleading. He went down the way a Navy aviator goes down, one knee back straight, eyes level with the eyes of the man he was addressing, and he reached for Walter's hand with both of his. Up in the galley, David quietly turned and watched. Megan and Tiffany came around the curtain to see what was happening and froze, the way you freeze when you walk into a room and feel the temperature has changed and you don't yet know why. "Sir," Captain Reeves said, his voice now steady but thick, "my father was Lieutenant Marcus Reeves. He flew with you on the night of October 14th, 1972. He came home because of you. I was 4 years old when you carried him out of that aircraft on the deck of the Constellation. I've been waiting my entire adult life to find you and tell you thank you." Walter's mouth moved. It took him a moment to make a sound. When he did, what he said was simply, "Marcus, he had a good boy. He used to show us pictures." The captain stood up. He walked back to the cockpit door, picked up the cabin intercom handset, and turned to face the entire first-class section. His eyes passed over Megan and Tiffany, who were still standing rigid at the front of the galley, and his eyes did not flinch, did not soften, did not give them anywhere to hide. Then he keyed the microphone, and his voice came over the speakers in every section of the aircraft all the way back to row 38. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we depart, I need to take a moment of your time. We have an honoured guest aboard this aircraft today. In Seat 2A is a man whose name most of you will not recognise, because for 30 years the United States Navy did not officially acknowledge that he or his squadron existed. His name is Lieutenant Commander Walter Hayes. Between 1969 and 1976, he flew classified reconnaissance and rescue missions in theatres that were never on the public map, in aircraft whose specifications were redacted from the public record until 2003. He flew through anti-aircraft fire, in conditions and over coordinates I am not at liberty to detail, to recover American servicemen who would otherwise have been left behind. One of those men was my father. I am alive today because Walter Hayes brought my father home. I would consider it the greatest honour of my career if you would join me before we taxi, in a moment of recognition for him. The cabin was absolutely silent. The man in 2B with the orange juice slowly set the glass down. A woman in 3C began to cry, quietly, into a napkin. The young man who had sighed in the jet bridge stood up from his seat in 4D, hesitated and then snapped to a clean civilian approximation of attention. And then, one by one, all through first class and back into economy, the passengers stood. They didn't clap. Clapping wasn't the right shape for this. They just stood. And Captain Reeves, in the aisle in his uniform, raised his right hand to his brow and held a salute that lasted a full 10 seconds before he lowered it. In the galley, Megan was holding the counter with both hands. Her face had gone the colour of paper. Tiffany was looking at her own shoes. David, the purser, stepped past them both, walked down the aisle, and stopped at row 2. He bent down to Walter and said, "Commander, I would be honoured to serve you anything on this aircraft for the duration of this flight. Coffee, water, a meal, a blanket. Whatever you need, sir, you simply look at me." Walter, for the first time that morning, smiled. It was a small smile, almost shy. "Just some water, son, and maybe when we're up a cup of coffee, black. Eleanor used to take it with cream, but I never could." The flight took off on schedule. Somewhere over New Mexico, Megan came down the aisle. She had taken a long time in the back galley. Her eyes were red. She stopped at row 2, and she did not smile, because she understood, finally, that a smile was not what was owed here. She bent down. She said, "Commander Hayes, I owe you an apology. What I said at the door, and the way I said it, was wrong. I was wrong. There is no excuse. I am very, very sorry." Walter looked at her for a moment. Then he reached up with one age-spotted hand and patted her gently on the wrist. "Young lady," he said, "I wasn't a commander when I started. I was a kid who didn't know which end of the runway was which. People were patient with me. Be patient with yourself, and next time, just maybe, be patient with the next old man who shuffles up to your door." She nodded. She couldn't speak. She walked back up the aisle and into the galley, and she sat down on the jump seat, and she put her face in her hands for a long minute before she got back up to do her job. Walter Hayes made it to San Diego that afternoon. He stood at the edge of the pier at Coronado as the sun went down. He didn't pray, exactly. He just stood there, with his old field jacket on his shoulders and the small gold wings on his lapel catching the last of the light, and he remembered. The Navy sent 2 officers to stand with him this year. They had received a phone call from a captain of a commercial airliner who had pulled some old strings he had not pulled in 20 years. The 2 officers stood a respectful 3 steps behind Walter, and they said nothing. They didn't have to. When the sun finally went down, Walter turned, and the older of the 2 officers offered him an arm, and Walter took it, and together they walked slowly back up the pier. At the end of the pier, parked at the curb, was a black sedan, and leaning against the sedan, still in his captain's uniform, having flown his return leg and then driven straight to Coronado on his layover, was Captain James Reeves. He opened the door for Walter himself. He drove him to dinner. They sat for 3 hours and they talked about a man named Marcus and a night in 1972 and all the years in between. Walter passed away 11 months later, peacefully, in his small ranch house outside Fort Worth. At his funeral, a Navy Honor Guard fired a 21-gun salute. Captain James Reeves flew in to deliver the eulogy. The flag from Walter's casket was folded 13 times and presented to Captain Reeves as next of kin, because Walter, who had no living family of his own, had quietly updated his will after that flight. And every year now, on October 14th, a commercial airliner out of Dallas takes a moment, just before departure, for its captain to come on the intercom and remind a cabin full of strangers that the quietest man in the room is sometimes the one who carried the heaviest things. Don't judge a man by his jacket. Don't judge him by his cane. Don't judge him by the slow way he shuffles down a jet bridge. The people who have given the most are very rarely the ones who tell you about it. If this story moved you, if you believe every veteran deserves to be met at that cabin door with respect instead of a sideways glance, subscribe to this channel, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and leave one word in the comments below: honor. Because Walter Hayes earned it, and so did every quiet old man like him who is still, somewhere out there right now, shuffling down a jet bridge with a folded jacket and a story he will probably never tell.